Good afternoon. It is my delightful pleasure to welcome you all to this very special afternoon. As you know, it was originally scheduled to be out of doors on the south lawn of the Scheide mansion, but there are certain advantages to having it here. The acoustics are better here, and also the seating is a lot more comfortable here. So we usually talk about distinguished guests. You are all distinguished guests, but I would especially like to welcome Mrs. Judy Scheide, who is seated immediately here to my right. Judy is the wife of the former William H. Scheide. She has flown all the way from Princeton to be here. She's been staying with us overnight. We've had great pleasure of her being with us. We've known her for, 20, 25 year long time. We have known each other. And she will have an opportunity to share. She has so much to talk about when it comes to the Scheide family. There's nobody. Bill's daughter was talking with me by the phone the other day, and Bobby said, her name's Bobby. Bobby said there's nobody more familiar with the Scheide family than Judy. So Judy's going to speak after the intermission. But I have just a few remarks. Marilyn, you all know Marilyn Black. I mean, so it is spoken, so let it be done. And Marilyn said that we were not to take, I assume she's told you gentlemen, not more than 2 to 3 minutes. But Judy has a special dispensation from Marilyn, because Judy is the expert here. Also, of course, I'm very glad to welcome members of the Erie Philharmonic, who will be playing pieces from Bach's Brandenburg concertos this afternoon. And if you've read your program, you understand exactly why they'll be playing from Bach. In 1946, Bill Scheide founded the Bach Aria group in New York City. He, of course, was a native of Titusville, grew up in Titusville, but Titusville is not exactly the place to find the talent necessary to establish such a group. It was founded in New York City and included stars of the Metropolitan Opera, including, if I recall correctly, Eileen Farrell, and also numerous instrumentalists from the New York Philharmonic, some from the NBC Symphony, who had had the privilege of playing under the leadership of Arturo Toscanini. I believe that is correct. Well, I'd like to talk to you very briefly about what I call the threefold cycle of guts, generosity, and gratitude. Being in the homiletics business, you catch immediately the threefold nature of the talk, and to keep me going in my dilapidated early senility, I've given them all the letter G. Guts, or if you prefer, creative gumption, generosity, and gratitude. That is why we are here. And first, let's talk about the guts aspect, or the creative gumption. Bill grew up in the house that I hope some of you, if you haven't already had the opportunity to see, will take advantage and see it later in the afternoon. Bill grew up in that house. He loved that house. His bedroom was immediately above the famous library, and he had the wonderful privilege of, as he chose, going down into the library and paging through the Gutenberg Bible, handwritten speech by Abraham Lincoln, given in 1856, an original printing of the Declaration of Independence, Shakespeare's, I believe, first, second, third, and fourth folios. All four were included, I believe, at the time. Is that correct? Yes. And he did, and he himself developed a love of books. His father predeceased him. His father died in 1942. But his mother lived on in Titusville until 1959. But Bill had, in the meantime, as I noted earlier, moved to Princeton, New Jersey, so that he could found the Bach Aria group. But in 1959, he came back. She had broken her hip. And he came back not only to be with her in her last days, but also then to settle her estate and to tend to the complexity of relocating this exceedingly valuable collection of books. Even at that time, it was known to be the most valuable collection of rare books in private hands. And the relocation of it to Princeton was quite an effort. In any case, I have heard from both Bill years ago, and I wonder if anybody here remembers Marshall Fisher and his wife Gretchen. Marshall, okay, you remember. You've been around for a while then. Well, I knew them too. At least I knew Gretchen. Marshall Fisher was the superintendent of schools immediately preceding Gibb Park and then Howard Newson. He stood about 6'7". He could be very intimidating, and he and his wife Gretchen happened to be very close friends of Bill and his then wife Lorna. So at a private dinner, just the four of them, I'm sure they were discussing the relocation of the library to Princeton. And as I have heard the story both from Bill and, as I said, from Gretchen Fisher, who was still very much alive, still very much around when I came to Titusville, out of the clear blue, Marshall said to Bill, "What would you think of giving the Scheide mansion to the school district?" During that time, of course, the children of the baby boom were moving through the school system. They needed expanded space. It was a gutsy request. Now, how do I know that? Well, Bill knew how to use the word no very effectively. He also knew how to use it with some regularity, and he could also use it very, very firmly, am I right, when necessary. So it was a gutsy request. And here we come into we move from gutsy to generous. Bill's, I understand, immediate response was, "That's an excellent idea, absolutely." And for 55 years, this community was most grateful for the use of that beautiful space as the headquarters for our school system. And then about 5 years ago, the board decided, it was not an easy decision, but they decided that they would relocate it, the administrative headquarters, from what we called Scheide House to a wing of the high school. So what to do with Scheide House? That became a problem. It was put on the market. Am I right, Lynn? Lynn was on the school board at the time. There were no reasonable, no credible offers made. An attorney who couldn't come up with the financing said she was interested. Yes, no, maybe, hopefully, finally no. Another offer was made, but it was a ridiculously low offer. And at that point, I was on the board of the All Region Alliance, and I remember distinctly we had come to the end of a rather lengthy meeting, and I know that many of you sit on similar boards, and you know when it comes to new business, you're all saying, "Oh, please, let's just bring this to an end." You remember it well, don't you? Out of the clear blue, I said to the board, "How would you respond if we could convince the Titusville Area School District to give Scheide House to the Oil Region Alliance of Business, Industry, and Tourism?" Now, you need to know, if you don't already know, that we had not too long before that finished our work on the Ida Tarbau House. The work was expensive, the work was time-consuming, the work was all engaging. Am I right, Marilyn? It was all those things and more. And we were all aware that that kind of task is very difficult. Interestingly enough, their answer was an immediate yes. That was, under those circumstances, a gutsy answer. We didn't know from where would we get the funding. How would we have the energy to pull it off? Would it work? Could we make it self-sustaining? Our policy is that all of our historical preservation buildings are self-sustaining. But almost immediately, Marilyn, my recollection is that the board was unanimous with yes. But here's where the cycle of generosity comes into play. What about the school district? Well, I had a plant on the school board. She's going to speak in just a little bit. Now, you have to understand, she was a newbie. I'm talking about my wife, Lynn. Lynn was a newbie on the school board at that time. And it was not an easy decision. Not all the board were immediately in favor of this. Am I correct? So it was yes, no, maybe we're not sure, we don't know. And even when they decided that, yes, this would perhaps be a very good idea, school districts, we learn, can't simply decide of their own accord to give away such property. It had to go through the court system, and then it had to pass through. Chris Feely is somewhere here. There he is in the back. Chris is here today representing the Titusville Historical Society. It had to pass through the Historical Society. Graciously, they said, yes, we can serve as the pass-through for this. And this is where the final part of my little introductory talk comes into play. I make to this pledge, and I know my colleagues on the board of the Oil Region Alliance would join me in this. I know the staff would eagerly join me in this. We are committed to pouring every bit of talent, energy, creativity, resources into this project, so that what we are going to call the Scheide Cultural Center will become something that every member of this community and beyond will be very, very proud. So there you have it. Now, it's my great pleasure. Marilyn, I know, you'll forgive me. You'll forgive me. I'll have absolution later. Okay, it's with great pleasure that I now present, actually, he needs no introduction, my great friend, Lee James. Lee? Where are you? Lee, you're on my right. There you are, Lee. Nice to have you.
Okay. Good afternoon, all. It's nice to be with you today. Thank you for the opportunity to address the folks. When the call came in, I said, well, what would you like to hear about? And they said, well, historic preservation makes sense, and the Scheide House. Well, I assume that everybody in the room knows more about the Scheide House than I do, so I chose historic preservation. And I'm a numbers guy, so a small portion of my comments, which I do plan to come in on time, will be sort of numbers oriented. But for those of you who imagine and believe that you understand what historic preservation is, let me give you the dictionary definition and see if it matches up with your understanding. Historic preservation definition is to preserve and protect buildings, landscape, and other historically significant artifacts, specifically the built environment, meaning not the natural landscape, but that which men and women have created and put their hands to. Preservation is meant to promote the general welfare of the entire community, and I think that's consistent with our understanding, and I believe that that takes place in most cases. As a treatment, and by that I mean preservation in action, new exterior additions are not within the scope of the definition, but limited and sensitive upgrading of mechanical, electrical, plumbing, the things of everyday life in our own homes, within reason and up to code specifications, of course, are considered appropriate. And I think that's what has taken place and what is expected to take place at the Scheide House. Distinctive materials, features, construction, techniques, period craftsmanship, all must be preserved. And I think we're delighted to know that. A word about sustainability. Probably have a good understanding of that by now. And delayed maintenance. And the word is don't. Don't delay. If you sense you have a problem, the longer you put it off, the more it will cost you to remediate down the road. Now I want to talk a little bit about numbers. For those of you who maybe, like me, don't have a lot of handy construction skills but want to be participants, there are tax incentives to historic preservation. Federal Historic Preservation Tax Incentive has leveraged a little over $100 billion in private enterprise, private investment, since the establishment of it in 1976. And that includes over 43,000 historic sites throughout our country. So it's an arm of government that seems to be working pretty well. Many of these are located in communities, well, really all across the country, but not all in major metropolitan areas, like in Pennsylvania, not all Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but, for example, right here in Titusville. About 15% of the total projects are actually in communities of 25,000 folks or less. So it's truly widespread and widely applicable. For those who are looking for a little break from Uncle Sam, there is a 20% investment tax credit, which is available for the rehabilitation of historic and income-producing buildings. There's also a 10% tax credit for the cost of rehabilitating non-historic buildings if they were built prior to 1936. So there are opportunities out there. Needless to say, when Uncle Sam is going to participate in part of the cost of this, there are hoops to jump through and a great deal of paperwork, but in the end, especially when the building is completed, it's quite well worth it, I think. And then finally, there are historic preservation easements, and these are tax benefits which are possible and perhaps even more complicated for donating historic properties to conservation organizations, possibly like ORA. The other good thing about this is, as you probably know, once a project gets going, it does create jobs, which is good for the local economy. And secondarily, it supports spin-off companies, which also support the effort as well. So in addition to the historic perspective, which we will get more of, especially with Ms. Scheide, there are other economic benefits to not only the organization, but the community, and it is well worth all our time to continue to show an interest in this. So thank you all for attending. That concludes my remarks, and let's get on with the show.
Okay, next I would like to introduce you to, if you don't already know him, Francis Wiederspan, one of our county commissioners. Francis?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Barry indicated, I am Francis Wiederspan, one of your commissioners, and it gives me great pleasure this afternoon to share a few words with you on behalf of the Crawford County Commissioners. It is certainly fitting that we are here today dedicating the William H. Scheide House, since May is National Historic Preservation Month. We commissioners are always glad to support projects such as this, projects in our communities that will preserve historic buildings of significance for all to enjoy both now and for future generations. The commissioners would like to commend the Titusville School District, the Titusville Historical Society, and the Oil Region Alliance for working together to move the ownership and care of the Scheide House from the school district to the Oil Region Alliance. We can all take comfort in knowing that the Oil Region Alliance is very capable and successful at rehabilitating and preserving historic structures. The Oil Region Alliance has certainly done a tremendous job of restoring and preserving the Ida Tarbell House just a few blocks away. It is now used extensively through various programs throughout the year. It will be interesting and exciting to watch the work of the Oil Region Alliance will undertake on the William H. Scheide House going forward, as well as their plans for its use by and for the public into the future. The Commissioners of Crawford County will continue to support the work of the Oil Region Alliance to preserve, promote, and develop the historical assets in our region for educational and recreational use for all who live here and those who visit here. We are proud of the Oil Region Alliance and the work that they do, and proud of our communities. May God bless this project and all who are and will be a part of it. Thank you.
Okay, it's now my pleasure to present to you a gentleman whom I had not met before today, Tim Butler, who is representing our Congressman Mike Kelly. Tim?
Let's see. I think we're good. Thank you, Doctor. I greet you on behalf of Congressman Mike Kelly. Unfortunately, he could not be here today, and unfortunately, you just get me. It is my pleasure to be here. Oftentimes, when we go out into the community, we are talked to about different ways that we can develop our communities, our towns, our homes, our cities. But rarely do we hear the conversations about preservation. So it's wonderful to be here gathered around a project that is just that, preservation. It's the much harder thing to do than just developing. It takes more people, more partnerships. I was going to name some of the partners that have all come together on the Scheide project, but I would miss some. But it's great when everyone comes and gathers together around one purpose and one project. And the goal is a structure or a facility that's over 100 years old. Let's put what we can into it to make sure that it's there 100 years from now, so that people that we may never meet get the same sense of wonder and awe from the passions of the family and the community that all came together to do that. So it's wonderful to be a part of that. It's wonderful to see it all come together. And if there's any way that we can continue to partner or help, please reach out and let our office know. But thank you for being here. Thank you.
Okay, and now representing the Erie Philharmonic, it's my pleasure to welcome and present Steve Weiser. Steve?
So I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Steve Weiser, and I'm the Executive Director of the Erie Philharmonic. And it's definitely a pleasure for us to be here today. When I got the call from Maryland just about a year ago, were we interested in doing a concert featuring the music of Bach and maybe the Brandenburg concertos? And pretty much before we knew any details, the answer was yes. For one thing that we've really wanted to strive to do as an orchestra, obviously everybody knows we're the Erie Philharmonic. We do our concerts in Erie at the Warner Theater. But as a previous musician with the orchestra, when I took over as executive director 4 years ago, we wanted to find a way to actually pay attention to 3 of the words that are in our mission statement. And as most of you know, mission statements tend to be 2 to 3 sentences long of a lot of words that don't mean anything, and maybe 3 or 4 words that do. And for us, and I think it's actually printed in your program book, we chose to focus on 3 words: entertain, educate, and enrich. And that, I think, is the nicest thing of what you're going to see today. Is this is one of those rare moments where you get all 3 of those words roped into one event. And rather than this being a big concert in a big Warner Theater where you're 300 to 400 feet away, here you're going to see music as it was originally intended. When Bach wrote these pieces, there wasn't a music director involved. This is how you heard it. So between the 6th concerto, which you're going to hear in a few minutes, and then the 5th concerto a little bit later, this is exactly how the music was intended to. So I think you're definitely in for a treat. Make sure you're listening in, make sure you're watching in. You'll see interactions with musicians that you normally don't get a chance to see when you're on stage and they're a good bit away from you. So it really is a special thing. You're certainly in for a treat. Again, we have Bach's Brandenburg 6 concertos coming up first, and the 5th is a little bit later. But that's pretty much it. We're delighted to be here today. Thank you so much from everyone with music director Dan Daniel Meyer, and all the musicians of the Erie Philharmonic, thank you so much. We're honored to be a part of this. We look forward to more collaborations in the future, but without any further ado, I'll give you the musicians of the Erie Philharmonic.
Thank you very, very much. I think, Judy, wouldn't you agree? Bill from somewhere up above is listening and enjoying this tremendously. It was perfect. It was beautiful. Okay, I'd like to introduce you to someone who I have known very well for almost half a century. Why are they laughing? They didn't think you were that old. Well, she married a much older man. What can I say? In any case, it's my pleasure to present to you my dear wife, Lynn Cressman, who is president of the Titusville Area School Board. Lynn?
I first met Bill Scheide in the 1970s when Barry and I were visiting Princeton. The Scheides invited us for dinner, and I was nervous. What was I, just a kid from the country, going to say to the Bill Scheide? I didn't need to worry. I had Barry with me. By the end of the evening, we were on the floor playing with blocks made from the original Drake well. Bill was absolutely delightful. But let's go back 2 generations to meet Bill's grandmother, Ida Hinsdale Scheide, who came to Titusville in 1881. Here, she and her husband, William, raised 2 children. She is remembered today for her tremendous devotion to civic work, both locally and statewide. Here in Titusville, she was active in the Women's Society in the Presbyterian Church, the Titusville Women's Club, Associated Charities, and the Women's Auxiliary at the Titusville Hospital. Biographers note that she was a political woman, deeply involved in public education. In fact, she campaigned for a woman to be elected to the school board. Imagine that. And she succeeded. Nettie Grumbine was the first woman elected to the Titusville School Board. By 1922, Nettie was elected president of that board. Therefore, it was entirely fitting that her grandson Bill would have passed their beautiful Washington Street home, lovingly known as Scheide House, to the school district in 1949, because education has always been a priority for the Scheides. We in Titusville are the great beneficiaries of their generosity, their foresight, their wisdom. This is a family who has truly loved Titusville. Thank you, Judy, for being here today.
Now, we would not be here today if it were not for the man seated to my left, Chris Feely. Through the complexities of municipal and state government, it was necessary for the Scheide House to be passed on to an historical society. The Oil Region Alliance is officially known as the Oil Region Alliance of Business, Industry, and Tourism. Our focus is to attract business and industry to the area, and tourism is part of that. But we are not an historical society, so we needed. And they could have said, thank you very much, we'll keep it. But very graciously, they, within 24 hours, passed it along to us. So it is with great pleasure that I present to you Mr. Christopher Feely.
Good afternoon, and we'll move that down. Good afternoon, and thank you for attending this grand event. I'm extremely honored and humbled by Maryland's invitation to be part of this historic day in our oil region. Now, I'm listed as the 7th speaker, so I just want to say, Barry said this, I was going to say that, but Lee said that, Francis covered that, so Tim, you already hit that. I was going to bring my cello out and play that, and Lynn added some things. So I'm going to skip half my speech down to over the past 155 years, the House has seen its improvements and many decisions have been discussed and made in it. I ponder the thoughts of personal, family, community, and educational decisions that were made in that House. They were probably not all popular at whatever level, but there were 2 rooms in particular that I think acted as think tanks for some of these major decisions. On your tour and in future visits of that home, laugh please, that, okay. When you step inside the formal dining room or in the library, just think of all those major decisions that were made over the years. Some were family trips, property upgrades, when to sell, buy, or trade stock companies, and to enlarge a company, provide more jobs, or give students the best opportunities to learn. These 2 rooms were home to those decisions of many of the great community and economic leaders of the time in our city and in our region. More recently, over the past 50 years, decisions were made to add, like the THS Natatorium, the music department, the ECLC, and the middle school. There was even a decision by one of our greatest teachers of life, the late Howard Newson, to employ a young lady with a newborn baby. That'd be my mom. Decisions were made for the betterment of the commerce and trade decades ago, as well as the future of education of the hundreds of graduates from our area. In this discussion, as Barry just commented about, Superintendent Karen Jez approached me about how we're going to work this out. Unfortunately, she's not able to be here due to a family function, but she's proud to be part of this transition, as I am. At this time, I would like to thank the Ticeville Historical Society for its important decision for this transition. With a very successful renovation and proper usage of the Tarbell House, we are very confident that the Erie Region Alliance will make great and important decisions for the betterment of this project and the future of Scheide Cultural Preservation Center. Thank you, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
And now, Marilyn and I are going to have a personal conversation in front of this whole crowd, because this is Plan B. So, Marilyn, how long is this intermission going to last? Okay, so it is now 25 after 3. So in other words, we should reassemble at about 20 minutes to 4. I have that right. Now, Marilyn, just as important, where are all those cookies I sampled yesterday? All right, so let me explain that. You may reach, they were, I think, baked by your people. Your mother probably baked half of them. Yeah, students from the high school. All right. Well, in any case, you may reach the cookies by way of, is there room over there? But then, okay, they could get past that equipment. Okay, you guard the equipment carefully. Okay, by that way, or exit by that door and go all the way. There's a corridor immediately beyond this wall and down into the Scheide Hall, named after Bill's, in honor of Bill's father, who had a great devotion to Christian education. In any case, this way, that way, and back here at about 20 minutes to 4. Thank you.
Thank you.
Used to the New York tradition that when the lights begin to dim and flick back on, you're expected back in your seat. So congratulations, you are the sophisticates. Now to all the rest of you who are back in the Scheide Hall still munching on cookies, please return to the main auditorium. Marilyn, do you think they could hear that bellowing from the sanctuary? In any case, the musicians need to proceed because some of them have other things on their dockets for the day. So we're going to skip momentarily, just for a bit, the remarks by Judy and John Phillips' remarks, so that we can listen to the Brandenburg Concerto No. 5, so that some of these musicians can get back to Erie, where, as I said, some of them have other commitments later in the day. So, Marilyn, how successful are we? 15 seconds. Okay. 15. You say 60? Can I count backwards from 60? Well, I'll let my watch do it for me. Are you having a good time? Yeah. You know, we're sorry it couldn't be outside, but the acoustics in here are magnificent. You understand that this sanctuary was built in 1888, before the days of electrification, and certainly before the days of amplification. And so this arch, while we're waiting, this arch was built as a natural amplifier. Originally, the sanctuary had the choir loft and it was balcony-like affair, and the organ was a different organ, much smaller, and this was all back here further, so we didn't need amplification. Well, the amplification effect still exists to some degree, and the gentleman over here to my right came prepared with oodles of equipment. He said, I looked at the situation, and you didn't need to set it all up. Did I understand you correctly? Because the acoustics are so fine. Okay, Marilyn, how are we doing? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You're on. Welcome back. Welcome back. Members of the Erie Philharmonic. Playing Bach's. Let's look at the Concerto No. 5. Okay, those of you who are members of the Erie Philharmonic, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. Bill Scheide, whom, as you have heard, founder of the Bach Aria Group, would be enormously pleased to know that you played in this church. I wish you all a safe journey back to Erie or wherever you have come from, and we look forward to your return to Titusville. As is our policy, we have an open house when we first take over a property, and then once again, when we've completed our renovations. Judy and I have already been talking about inviting the group back to do a similar concert 2, 3, 4 years from now, whenever that takes place. And I think you join me. We look forward to that very eagerly. Okay, Judy. I think I mentioned to you that in talking with Bill's daughter, her name is Barbara, but we call her Bobby. Bobby said there's no member of the family who knows more about the Scheide family in all of its generations than Judy. And so it's our great privilege to have Judy here with us. Judy flew in from Princeton yesterday. She's spending the weekend with us. Judy, Lynn, and I have been friends for more than 20 years. So it was a great pleasure to have her back in Titusville. So Judy, I'm going to invite you up to the microphone, and I'm going to sit down right over here. You have a bottle of water with you. Judy has an allergy to pollens. This is perhaps the worst time of the year for that. And I also have a pocket full of menthol eucalyptus drops, citrus drops, if you should need them. Let's come over and measure this. Let's give it a try.
Good.
And I'm gonna put it right over here.
All right. Good afternoon. I'm Judy Scheide. I'm Bill Scheide's third wife. And because I married him when he was 89, all of the stories of his life were new to me. And he loved telling them to me. And so I was the new audience, and I got all of them, and they were wonderful. And I have to thank the Cressmans, Barry and Lynn. They're the most marvelous hosts. And when they invited me to come to this, I thought, oh, this is so important. I must just cancel everything else and come. And I'm just delighted to be here. And listening to the Brandenburgs, which were among Bill's very favorite parts of Bach. I remembered that when Bill was listening, especially to Bach, you couldn't speak to him. He wasn't with you. He was in the music, somewhere in the music. He wouldn't hear anybody speak or pay attention to anything else if he was listening, because he was right there in the music. And it's marvelous to be here. I came with Bill and his second wife and his librarian. In 1996, Bill's librarian and I drove them here because Bill had just gotten a new car and he wanted to go to Titusville. And it took about 8 hours to get here from Princeton all the way across Pennsylvania. So I met the Cressmans then, and we've stayed good friends. Is this a good place for the microphone? Can you hear me well? All right. Well, among Bill's favorite stories were the story of his grandfather, William Taylor Scheide. His father, Sam Scheide, was a baker in Germantown. And he loved history. And so he loved the current general, who was who became the 12th president of the United States, Zachary Taylor. And he wanted William T., when he was born, to be named Zachary Taylor Scheide. But the baby's mom, Tam's wife, said, no, I don't like the name Zachary. You can keep the Taylor, but let's give him the name William. So that happened. And she died when William was quite young, and Sam married again and had more children. And this wife didn't mind what he called the children. And so the next boy was named Millard Fillmore Scheide. And the one after that, Henry Clay Scheide. And Bill remembered when he was a child when Uncle Mill would come to visit. But William T. Scheide, after he left the Civil War, which he went to join when he was very young, 16, decided to go to Pittsburgh and become a telegraph operator. And Bill said that as he watched these barges come down the Allegheny River with barrels of oil on them, I mean, this would have been about 1869. And the first well, Drake Well in Titusville, was in 1859. So the oil industry was very new. And he decided he didn't want to be a telegraph operator. He wanted to be an oil cadder and go after wells. So he and his friend, Grandin, discovered 3 really good oil wells. And they sold them to John D. Rockefeller, who was a young man, just 8 years older than William T. Scheide, who had come from Cleveland. And he had been a Sunday school teacher. I don't know how many of you know that. But John D. Rockefeller was a Sunday school teacher. And his favorite story from the Bible was the one about Joseph of the coat of many colors, who was left in a pit by his brothers because they were jealous, and later was sold to Egypt and became a right-hand man to the Pharaoh. Well, Joseph was framed by Potiphar's wife because he wouldn't pay attention to her, and he was thrown in jail. And he started interpreting dreams of all of the other prisoners. And the Pharaoh heard about it. And he called Joseph and he said, I have this terrible dream that I've been having night after night. What does it mean? And the dream was about these 7 beautiful fat cows who were eaten by 7 really thin cows. And he said, what does it mean? And Joseph said, well, that means that Egypt is going to have 7 years of plenty when the grain will be beautiful, and you must collect it and store it, because after this you're going to have 7 years of plenty, of famine rather, and there'll be very little food and the crops won't grow. So store up all of this wonderful grain, as much as you can, and then you'll have it to give to your people. Well, of course, that's when all the sons of Jacob came back and met Joseph again, and that's how the whole group, all the 12 tribes, ended up in Egypt. Well, so Rockefeller said, this is the greatest idea. He wasn't going to go look for oil. He was going to buy it up. So that's what he did, and that's what Standard Oil did. He formed a little company, and they bought up as much of the oil as they could so that they would have it when the oils ran dry. And this was the whole basis of it. It was this story from the Bible that gave John D. Rockefeller the idea to do what he did. And he told this story to Bill's grandfather, who then told it to his son, who told it to Bill. Now, when Bill was a very little boy, about 7 or 8, and his grandfather had died by then. But his grandfather, who worked for Standard Oil for 20 years, had been able to buy Standard Oil stock every month. He could put aside money and buy it for 11 cents a share. And by the time he had worked for Standard Oil for 20 years, he had $1 million worth of stock. And he said, you know, no man needs more than that. So I'm going to resign and start collecting books, which is what he did. Well, Bill's father said to Bill when he was about 7 or 8, someday you're going to inherit a great deal of money, but that money will not belong to you. You are merely the steward of it. You must give as much of it away as you can, and never think that you own that money. It is not yours. You're the caretaker. And that's the way Bill lived his life. He gave away 80% of his income, because he believed that was what his role in life was. And he did so many great things. When W.T. first came here, he lived in Tidioute, in an apartment above kind of a store or a company. And I better have the water, Barry. And he met Ida Hinsdale because she had come from the East to visit a friend. Thank you. And he married her. He had proposed in a horse-drawn carriage going up one of the hills outside Tidioute. So they got married, and they lived in Tidioute for a while, had 2 children, John and Gertrude. But Ida said, you know, this is no place to bring up children. There's oil in the streets, the sidewalks are not pleasant, they're made of wood, it's dirty here, I want to be in a better place. Let's go live in Titusville, which is much more beautiful than Tidioute. And so that's why they moved here. And W.T. built the house on Main Street. And he was a friend. He had become a friend of the original Tiffany, who then helped him design windows. He designed the windows, which were Tiffany glass. And William T. he started traveling in Europe, and he brought home beautiful tiles. Every room had a fireplace that was made of some different kind of tile from Europe. Now that Main Street house is still here, and I would suggest that someday, way in the future, that be made a preservation house as well. And I know that one of the owners is here, I believe. Is that right? Is she here now? I hope so. But there she is. They took us on a tour of the house a few years ago, and it's still beautiful. And they're doing a wonderful job of restoring it. But Bill lived there. Well, I have to go back a little. His grandfather died in 1907. He had sent John to Princeton University. And John went there with his great friend, Jim Caldwell, who lived up the street. Now, Jim Caldwell married John's sister, Gertrude. And John married Gertrude's best friend from her school, which was out east. And her name was Mary Abba Hewitt. And they were married in 1904 and went on a honeymoon to Venezuela. And when they came back, John had developed tuberculosis, and they had to go out to the Saranac Sanitarium, the Trudeau Sanitarium, where they spent 2 years, and John was healed, came back, decided to start a family. But when their baby, Mildred, was born, she was born dead, and Mary Abba died 2 days later, and it was a terrible, terrible sadness in the family. And John and his mother, Ida, and his father, John and his wife, Harriet, well, I'm getting a little mixed up here. John and his mother and his sister and brother-in-law went to Europe. And when they came back, one of their neighbors was Gertrude Lammers. I think some of you have heard of the Lammers family. And Gertrude Lammers had a best friend who lived in New York, who had grown up in Titusville but had moved to New York and had cared for her mother and her sister when they had tuberculosis, and had become a social worker at the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church. Well, Gertrude Lammers decided that you can't let this go to waste, this very handsome widower who lived in Titusville. So she invited her friend Harriet to come back to Titusville and meet John Scheide, which she did. And they were married soon after. And they were both early 40s. And Bill was born when his mother was almost 41. And he was the only child. He lived in the house on Main Street with his grandmother, Ida, his Uncle Jim, and his Aunt Gertrude, and his parents. So here's this little child living with these adults, 5 adults. And I think that might have been a little tough, but he managed. And when his grandmother died in 1921, Bill's father, she left the house to Aunt Gertrude and Jim and left the library that WT had started collecting to John. And so they moved away. They went around the corner to Washington and bought the Scheide house that you know today. And then John built the library because he had inherited all these wonderful books from his father, and then started collecting more. He bought the Gutenberg Bible and the first folio of Shakespeare and one of the first copies of the Magna Carta and other marvelous things. And his father, when he went to Princeton, said that one of his professors had said the greatest things that happened to Western civilization were the founding of Christianity, the discovery of America, and the invention of printing. And so he's concentrated on those things for the library. And Bill grew up until he was 7 on Main Street. And then they moved to Washington, and his father built this wonderful library. And Bill could go downstairs anytime he wanted and take a book from the shelf and look through it. He did that, and he learned so much. But then he went to Princeton, and his Uncle Jim Caldwell died on Pearl Harbor Day. And his Aunt Gertrude had died in 1932 with cancer. And before she had died, she had taken her half of the inheritance and put it in a trust fund. And the interest was to go to her brother and her husband, and upon their deaths would go to Bill. So here Uncle Jim dies in 1941 when Bill is 27, and his own father died in 1928 when Bill was 20. In 1942 when Bill was 28. And he said suddenly he had all this money, and he thought, what good thing can I do? So he founded the Bach Aria group, which, because people knew what Bill called the public Bach, which was the Bach B minor Mass and the Magnificat and the Brandenburgs. No one knew the beautiful arias that were in the cantatas. And Bill's father had given him a collection of Bach, all Bach's works, it was printed in 1890 something. And so Bill and Lorna took pictures of various pages of the aria, and then they would take the pictures and cut off all of the lines of the sopranos and all of the lines of the altos, and then scotch taped them, all the soprano lines on one page, all the alto lines. They did that with each voice and each instrument. We still have some of those. It's amazing to look at, because there were no printed copies of any of that, of any of the arias. And that's what they sang from in the very first days of the Bach Aria group. Well, Bill decided that Titusville was too far from New York City, and most of his singers and performers, orchestra members, were in New York. And so they moved to Princeton. And they had a little house on Aiken Avenue for a while. But then Lorna found out that there was a house on Library Place to move to. So they moved there in 1952. Had their 3 children. Actually, their daughter Bobby was born here, because when Bill finished his degree at Columbia, where he had met Lorna, he went to Cornell to do a doctorate, but his father died, and he had to come home to help manage the funds. Well, they moved to Princeton, had a wonderful time there, living on Library Place. Bill bought the house, I think, in 1952, and lived there until he died in 2014. I'd like to go back to a couple of stories about Bill's childhood. When I look down here, I recognize Bill's family pew, I believe, was either the second or the third, right over here. Is that right? And when we were first married in 2003, there was quite an excitement over the book of Revelation. I don't know if any of you were aware of that, but people were worried about what was going to happen and when it was going to happen, and if they would be called up to heaven. And some of the people that we knew very well were very concerned about it. So I said to Bill, "Did you ever read the book of Revelation?" He said, "Oh, yes, I read it several times." I said, "When was that?" And he said, "Well, when I was about 10 at church, and if the pastor gave too long a sermon and I got bored, I'd take the Bible and read Revelation. And my mother didn't mind if I was reading the Bible." He said, "I read Revelation because it was so exciting. So I read it several times." Well, his mother was quite a biblical scholar herself. And in 1921, when Bill was 7, started giving him $5 for every chapter of the Bible he could memorize. I mean, at 21, $5 was a big amount of money. And he made quite a bit of money memorizing chapters of Isaiah and parts of the New Testament. And he still knows them. He could recite the entire book of Isaiah if you asked him to. This was quite a childhood, I think. Anyway, another childhood memory was when Bill was 12. His father wanted to send him to camp, but his mother thought he was too young. So his father and several other parents bought some land just outside of town here that had an old shack and a stream and a little swimming hole. And they started a camp, and they hired a counselor from Princeton University, a young man who was going to become a Presbyterian missionary in China. And he came for the summer and was the counselor in this little camp. And they did all kinds of very interesting things. And there was Elmore Broadhurst was there, and the two Von Tacky boys, Richard and Tommy, and Benedict, yes, Cadwallader Benedict, and Dana Volkstadt, and then their counselor. And they all spent the summer out at this camp. And the parents brought, for the first 2 weeks, the parents brought dinner for them. But then they started cooking their own meals. And they did some very wonderful, funny things. So the next summer, Bill was trying to decide what to do. And his father said, "Why don't you write about the camp?" So he wrote a whole book, typed it himself, with diagrams about this camp. And when we were first married, he said, "I want you to read this." So we would read it together. And I said, "This has to be published." So eventually, the university, Princeton University, published the book. And it's beautiful. And we have extra copies of it. And I'm going to send them to the Cressmans, because I think the story of this Titusville camp in 1926 is so gripping and funny. And if you knew any of these families, you would really relate to it. Even if you don't, I didn't know them. It's a wonderful story of these 6 12-year-olds and what they did with their counselor in this camp in the summer. And it's such a slice of Titusville that I think most of you will enjoy reading it. And I'm going to send a box full of the books to Barry, and he can pass it out. Well, Bill was a wonderful Bach scholar, and he loved Bach, and he lived Bach, really. And in 1953, he found out that there was going to be a Bach portrait for sale in England that had been brought by this young German musician whose family had bought it in a thrift shop in 1820. It had belonged to Bach's family. There was an official portrait that was in the school, but the students thought Bach looked mean, and so they threw shoes and books at it, and it had to be repaired. And the people who had repaired it had painted out all of the lines in the face and the lights in the eyes, and it doesn't really look like a real person. But they also had one made for the family. And this was left to C.P.E. Bach and his daughter. And she died in 1790. And it disappeared until 1820 when the Janka family, someone in the Janka family found it, and they kept it until 1939. And they were a Jewish family. And the mother of the family told her son, "You must leave here and take the portrait. Leave Germany, because I fear for what is happening." And so he got on his bicycle and rode all the way across Germany and got across the Channel and went to England and visited a friend of his that he had been to camp with when he was young, whose name was John Eliot Gardner, who had a farm. And he asked if the Gardners would take care of the painting. And they gave him a little house on the property. He married an English woman, had 3 children. But by 1952, he wanted enough money to send his children to good schools, whether they passed the test, this very strict test in England. I don't know if they still have it, but when you were 11, you took this test and it decided your life. You either were able to go on to school, or you became an apprentice at the age of 11. And so he wanted his children to have a really good education. So he sold it, and Bill bought it. And it was on the wall of Bill's house all that time until he died in 2014. And every morning when he came down, Bill would say, "Good morning, sir." And at night he'd say, "Good night, sir," to the painting. Well, we found out that young John Eliot Gardner, who is now one of the foremost conductors and musicians in England, was born in 1943. And when he would come down the stairs, he would see the Bach portrait every morning and then see it again when he went upstairs. And when he was 10 years old, the portrait disappeared because it had been sold to Bill Scheide. So John Eliot Gardner, many years ago, many years later, when he was 60, 50 years later, came to our house to see the painting again. And he convinced Bill not to leave it so that the Bach Archive could buy it from him, but to just leave it to them. And Bill said yes, he didn't want anyone to have it and then hide it. So the Bach portrait went to Leipzig, Germany, with great festivity in 2015. They were so excited. And people would come up to me on the street and say, "Oh, danke, Frau Scheide, danke." It had been 267 years since the portrait had been there. And they were just delighted to have it back. Well, I think I've talked long enough, but I do want to tell you one more thing, and that is, when I first met Bill and I started going to the Presbyterian Church, there was a reading one morning about Elijah, and Elijah getting in the flaming chariot and going up to heaven. And he had an assistant or a follower or a disciple named Elisha. And as he was speeding off in the fiery chariot, Elisha said, "You cannot leave without giving me something." And Elijah said to him, "Take whatever of my spirit that you can handle. Take as much of my spirit as you can get." And off he went. And when Bill died, my brother, who's a minister, came to do the homily, and I told him about that. And so the entire homily was about what Bill left to all of us through his spirit, and what we could take, studying Bill's life, what we could take of his spirit to grab and take with us. And that's what Barry and Lynn have done, and all of you people from the oil Region Alliance, and all the people at the Scheide House, and all the school board members. You've grabbed part of Bill Scheide's spirit, and you're running with it. And Bill would be so delighted. He would be cheering and thinking, this is the right thing. I'm so pleased what you're doing with the Scheide House. I have to tell you, if you've gone on the tour, someday take a look at the attic. It has the best attic I've ever seen. All kinds of funny little rooms and cupboards. And Bill used to play up there, and he said it was wonderful. Anyway, thank you for grabbing Bill's spirit and running with it. And I'm looking forward to seeing what's going to happen next to the Scheide House. And perhaps on stages you'll have more days like this, and people can come and see what's happening. And I love all of you for doing this. It's wonderful. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for putting together this day and what you will do in the future. Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you so much.
Judy is such a lovely lady. She really is. I have often thought, because I've known Bill since 1971 is when Bill and I first met, that Judy was really responsible, and she knows, I've said this to her myself, for Bill's exceedingly long life. She would make sure that Bill's mind was kept active by taking him to all sorts of cultural events in Princeton. Even though he would have to be taken in a wheelchair, she'd take him. She was responsible. She would say, well, today is the day we're going to have your trainer here. And the trainer, of course, we all knew was, in fact, a physical therapist. But to have a trainer is so much more exciting, am I right, Judy, than to have a physical therapist. So, Judy, it's a great privilege to have you with us.
He had a kung fu.
Yes, he did. He had a kung fu specialist. Yeah, he was some fella. And we're so fortunate to have had him and have you here.
He did the most wonderful thing. One thing that he did that you might all try. And that is that every morning we listened to music for half an hour before we got up. And it was either Bach or Schubert, usually. And he said that he did that because it centered him. It centered his mind for the day. And on his 100th birthday, he played a recital of Bach for a group. And also, he had memorized all the funny poems in Alice in Wonderland and Alice with the Looking Glass. And he could recite them by heart. But And he would do that. He recited them for his great-grandchildren who were all gathered around him on his birthday. He was just a remarkable person and totally lovable and fun.
Yes, he was. When we visited the Scheides, it would have been about 2004, and we were caught in a snowstorm and stranded there. And I remember Bill's previous wife had died, Dodo. We called her Dodo. Her real name was Gertrude, but a plaque at the back, by the way, is a plaque in memory of her grandfather, Lammers, John Lammers. And Bill had bought himself for his 89th birthday, a Bösendorf piano, exceedingly fine piano. Has some extra keys, am I right, David? Has some extra keys, bass keys. And a softer touch than Steinway. And my son Toby was fascinated by this large piano in their living room. And Bill sat down at age 89 and played Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata completely from memory. Beautiful. Well, let's see. Next on the agenda is John. And John, where are you? You're up at the balcony. Oh, you're right there. Okay. Don't scare me like that. Okay, John.
Thank you. Well, Mrs. Scheide, we're thrilled to have you. Thank you so much for coming and joining us from Princeton. It is a celebration. We're honored. In case you didn't know, I'm the president of the Oral Region Alliance, and I meant to tell Barry to tell you you could call us ORA, because that's what everybody else does, because it is kind of a long name. But these types of events and these types of projects wouldn't happen without our sponsors and without the folks that give us confidence and have confidence in us. But one thing I would be remiss if I didn't say it. And I always say that they make very difficult projects and sometimes nearly impossible projects look easy, and that is my staff. So would you please give my staff a round of applause? Yeah, Marilyn's going to speak in it, but there's a whole lot of, had most of my staff here if you went on any of the tours, and also our volunteers, because our volunteers are very committed to our mission, and the Scheide Project is really only one of many things that we do. But as far as this particular day, I have to mention our sponsors of this day. They're great partners of ours. Our grand sponsor is our friends at Clarion University and the Barbara Morgan Harvey Center for the Study of Oil History. They've been a great partner of ours in our educational side of our business, and it is a fantastic group to work with. And then, of course, our very near and dear partners here in Titusville, the Titusville Council on the Arts, Titusville Renaissance, Titusville Area Chamber of Commerce, the Titusville Historical Society, as you heard of. Our friends at Stewart's Premier Catering, I hope you appreciated and enjoyed the beverages and the food. And then, of course, the Oil Region Coalition of Artists. We're so very happy and so very blessed in this region to have those types of organizations, but we have very caring people that volunteer and put money towards projects like this. And you met them when you came in. Clark and Carol Hall, Lois and Neil McElway were all greeters, and then there were some other anonymous donors for today. So if you would please give our sponsors a round of applause. Again, thank you from the staff and myself and if you have not been to the house, please take advantage of that, and you can see where we're getting started, and you'll find out a little bit more about that exciting event right now. Thank you.
Now, thank you, John. I believe next on the agenda is Harold Best. Harold is working with the architectural firm that is putting all this together. So, Harold, are you from Erie?
No, sir. I used to live there. I live in Seneca and Franklin.
Well, welcome to Titusville today for this special occasion.
Oh,
We look forward to, you worked with the Ida Tarbell House, right?
Yes, I sure did. Need to get this down where I can talk so y'all may be able to hear me, because normally I don't talk very loud, except for my wife says I'm not talking loud, then I have to talk a little louder. But anyway, from the firm of Structures, we're located in Seneca, and we are very pleased to be part of this project. As you mentioned, we were part of the Ida Tarbell House project, which took quite a number of years, but this project, I think, is going to move quite a bit faster. I think the key to this project is preservation, and we're moving the project not only to completion as soon as possible, but getting the project started. The initial phase of the project is, of course, deals with the library part of the project, and we've done the plans and specifications. The contractors have been selected, and work should start quite soon. The project is scheduled to be completed, hopefully phase 1, by the end of August this year, and then we'll move on to the additional projects which need to be done, which will address accessibility and other issues, minor issues in the house, but restoring it both for keeping the project or the house going on for many years, and also the history of the house, which you've heard about and will be talked about. But again, we're quite proud to be part of the project and look forward to the completion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now she comes last on the agenda, but this is the lady who is the energy behind all of this, the lady who's behind the energy that made the Ida Tarbell project a beautiful reality, and the lady who really has taken the ball with this and is carrying it fast forward towards the goal line. Marilyn.
Good afternoon, or perhaps I should say good evening, as it's now turned 5 o'clock. We are so delighted that each of you have been able to be with us to be part of this very special day. And we look forward to your involvement in the years, and hopefully it won't take us 7 years from start to finish on the rehabilitation as the Tarbell House did. I would like to add my best wishes, as did John, to the staff of the ORA who were here: Juliet, Jen, Kathy, Emily, John, and the other folks that were not able to, on our staff that were not able to join us here today. I'd also like to extend greetings to the terrific volunteers from Take Bride, Titusville Historical Society, and the members of the Heritage Advisory Council for the Oil Region Alliance. I get to give you a peek into a crystal ball as to what we anticipate. Mr. Best has described the first 3 phases, with the second phase being dealing with the stabilization of the building. Its east end has subsided over several decades, and we're going to need to deal with that. The third phase is a very simple one. We will be adding a way that a person who is wheelchair bound, for example, will be able to enter the house safely and conveniently. We'll be doing that at the back porch area by adding an external lift. And the ones that we have been shown pictures of in Erie are so neat. They're camouflaged in, and if you don't even realize that's a lift, it looks like part of the porch. So I'm very pleased that we'll be able to have that innovation in this area. The phases beyond that are going to be sequenced in accordance with the preservation plan that has already been prepared, but many decisions have not yet been made on exactly what is going to go where and so forth. But the first floor is envisioned as the Scheide Cultural Preservation Center. We look forward to inviting a number of nonprofit organizations to join us. We will be having a branch office of the Oil Region Alliance there on the first floor, but most of the space will be our fellow occupants, entities that deal with education, arts, culture, drama, music, history, and heritage. And we look forward to gradually assembling those occupants once we are able to do a certificate of occupancy, a really important another legal step that has to occur. And then we proceed through other parts and enhancements for the building to make it not only consistent and an example of best practices, but also to be very functional. The pace at which we can proceed with that, of course, is dependent on fundraising. And so the only thing we're going to say about fundraising is, on your program, you have our address, our phone number, and when the opportunity presents itself and you are looking for a giving opportunity of any size, please do consider this among your ways to contribute either monetarily or as we gradually furnish the house to be the period of the Scheide family occupancy, which is from 1922 to 1959, and other ways to help with the buildings and grounds. So we look forward to together seeing that develop. And with that, again, we return things to our MC.
Well, Marilyn, why don't you stay here for just a minute?
Oh, no.
I'm not going to present you with gifts or anything like that.
Oh, good. I'm not retiring yet.
No,
That's a year.
no, we wouldn't want that, Marilyn.
That's a year from now.
No, well, how about 2 or 3?
No.
No, it says here that next, that I'm to extend an invitation to tour. Okay, now is it too late? Are we okay?
No,
We're okay with that?
We're good.
Now, you need to get down there, so.
I do.
Should we say, give them about.
No, I'm just.
You could be there in 5 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. Doors will be open?
Yes.
All right, okay. All right, we're so glad that all of you could come. You just were party to that conversation. If you haven't had a tour yet, well worth the tour to see the before version. There are actual photographs taken from the Scheide era, when the Scheides lived there. Very careful photographs were taken of virtually every room of the house, and they are there. They're enlarged. You can see them. I would strongly recommend you go. It's a fascinating place. A lot of what was originally there is still there, especially in the library, where the chandeliers are original. The fireplace equipment is original. The university wanted those things, and the school board said no. So there are some original things still there, and of course the building itself. So thank you again. We're grateful for your presence.